The Hidden Secret to Fixing Lower Back Pain, Part 1. Hey everybody, this is Mike Erlob with another episode of Power Your Life. I am super excited to be talking with you today because we are going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, the hip flexors. Now, I just love to geek out, talk about different muscle groups and how it interacts and really can influence different parts of your body. And the hip flexors, they are one of the most, if not the, well, I'm going to say they are the most important muscle group for you to understand when it comes to lower back pain. So, and I don't want to bore you guys with a bunch of, crazy mumbo jumbo scientific talk, but I think this is really super important though to spend some time looking at and talking about, because the more you can understand how the hip flexors influence and cause back issues, and not just back issues, they cause a lot of other issues throughout the body, the more you're going to be able to really get effective at fixing your back pain for good. And that's why we call this the hidden secret, because this is a subject that, although it's becoming a little bit more popular recently, not very many people really know a lot about them. They don't know a lot about their hip flexors. So let's dive right into it and let's talk about this. So the hip flexors in particular, and the hip in general, it's a group of muscles, okay? And there's one muscle in particular that we're going to really be focusing on, and that is what we call the psoas, and that's spelled P-S-O-A-S. The P is silent, but we say psoas. So it's one of that it is the hidden secret to fixing your lower back pain. You see, over the years, I've found that there are many people, many clinicians, and including doctors and other therapists and chiropractors and a lot of healthcare practitioners who just don't know how to fix lower back pain. And I can't tell you how many clients I've had over the years who have come in to see me, and they've come in after seeing different other healthcare professionals, and their back pain is just not getting any better. And when I sit down and I talk to them and then I go through the exam, the one thing I always go to is I go directly into their hip flexors and specifically to that psoas muscle. And as I'm looking at that and pushing in, palpating how tender that is, one client in particular I remember that just really stands out in my mind, he about jumped off the table. And he had gone to another location and he had I think probably 11 or 12 sessions, and his back pain wasn't any better. And I asked him, I said, well, did anybody look at your hip flexors? And no one had ever even looked at them. Nobody had ever even seen how tender they are, how sore they were on him. And I knew right away that was his primary problem. And he's not the only one. There have been hundreds over the years that, if not thousands of clients that their hip flexors are the main problem that they're having when, especially the psoas, with lower back pain. It has to be addressed. And it's one of those things that, when somebody starts saying, hey, my back hurts, the immediate thing that they do is they just go directly to their back. And the thing you have to remember is your back pain is probably not caused directly by your back. It's caused by the imbalances of other muscle groups that are influencing your spine. So, let's get into this. Let's talk about the psoas. Let's get excited about this, okay? So the psoas is so important to the lower back. We're going to spend quite a bit of time understanding it. And not only can it affect your back, but it can affect your life. You see, your hips are one of the most important parts of the body. And if your hips and your hip flexors are not loose and healthy, then you're going to have all kinds of problems. And if you cannot move you can't move properly if your hips are not healthy. Okay? So every movement is impacted by your hips. Okay? Sitting, standing, twisting, bending, walking, climbing steps. The list goes on and on and on. When you're just out living your life, when you're working, when you're getting in and out of the car, when you're grocery shopping, when you're going dancing with your spouse, when you're doing those kinds of activities, working in the yard, picking up the laundry. Your hips, that's what creates that movement, okay? So the hips, they're very complex. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to grab my model Bob, and I want to talk about, first we're going to talk about your hips. I want to talk about that a little bit. So your hips are made up of your pelvis, okay? So your pelvis is actually made up of 3 individual bones that fuse together, but as a unit, we refer to it as your pelvis, all right, and your femur. And then the joint right there, it's a ball and socket joint. That's your hip joint, okay? That's the acetabulum, femoral acetabular joint. Now, the pelvis is connected to the lumbar spine, okay? So together, that makes up the lumbopelvic area. So the hips, they can affect the angle of the pelvis. So meaning your pelvis can tip forward, your pelvis can tip back, all right? And the orientation and the alignment of your hips will actually affect that, which then the angle of the pelvis will affect the spine. So we'll look at our other model here, and this one's a little bit easier to see. The legs have been removed, but your pelvis, when we look at the side, it can tip forward, okay? It can tip backwards. That's influenced a lot by your hip position, okay? And we're going to talk more about how that happens. Now, in this hip area, there are over 15 different muscles, okay? 15 different muscles. We'll grab Bob again. So these muscles, we break them up into groups, okay? So we think of this as your gluteal group. That's one group, all right? So that's your butt muscles, okay? And then we have the deeper muscles inside, which we call your hip rotators, all right? Your hip rotators are the ones that kind of turn your femur back and forth, okay? They actually give you some stability in there. Think of those kind of like the rotator cuff, the rotator cuff muscles of the shoulder. That's kind of like the rotator cuff muscles of the hip, okay? So you have your hip rotators. And then you have what we call our ab and adductors. So your abductors, these are the muscles on the side, right here, and they help pull the leg away from the body. And then you have the inside, okay, basically like your groin muscles. We call those the adductors, and they pull it towards. And then the last group we have the Iliopsoas group, which is in the front, okay? So that comes off of the spine and through the abdominal area and attaches to your femur. So I've got another picture right here, and that's the group we're going to talk about. So if you can see this, all right? So that's what we're going to talk about is the Iliopsoas group, all right? And that's made up, the most important portion of this is the Psoas Major. Now there's a Psoas Major, a Psoas Minor, okay? In fact, the Psoas Minor is pretty insignificant because there's actually people who don't even have that. And then you have this iliacus, which is this muscle that fills in the pelvis area, and this is a front view, and then it attaches to the femur. So the psoas, part of the iliopsoas, and we're not even going to worry about the iliacus because that doesn't influence the spine as much as that psoas does. The psoas is the prime mover in flexing of the hip, okay? So if you look at this, it comes off of the spine and it comes through the abdominal wall, and then it merges with the iliacus, and then it actually attaches down here to the femur. So we'll go back to that picture here in a minute, but what that does, use your imagination now. So we have the psoas coming off of here and then going through and attaching to the femur. And so its job is going to bring the leg up, all right? But it also helps you flex the spine. So if your legs are stationary and that muscle contracts, it can pull you forward. But it also stabilizes the spine, all right? So it provides stabilization. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. And it also helps by rotating. It will assist a little bit of the femur rotation, and it also will assist with a little bit of the adduction, bringing that leg to the inside. So the muscle does a lot of different things, but the primary function, the prime mover, is bringing the leg up, which is the movement of flexion, and bending the trunk forward, okay? So the thing that's important to remember with this is this psoas muscle right through here, and we'll get that picture again, all right? It is the only muscle that actually that connects the legs to the spine. Okay, so it comes, off of the spine, goes all the way through and connects to the femur. And that's the only muscle that does that, because all of the other muscles in your back that connect, they either connect the pelvis to the femur or they connect the pelvis to the back. But this is unique in the fact that this muscle connects the lower part of the body to the upper part of the body. And that's why it is so important. Now, I want to get a little bit more technical. That muscle, the psoas, actually takes its attachment off of these little side processes, off of the vertebrae and a little bit on those front bodies of the vertebrae. It actually comes off of all lumbar vertebrae and even the 12th thoracic vertebrae. So it goes up so high, it can actually influence some of the actions of the diaphragm too. And so it can actually influence your breathing patterns. But it comes off of that, and then as I mentioned before, it passes through the pelvis, okay, through the abdominal area, and then it blends with that iliacus, and then it continues through the groin, and then it attaches right into this little PC, we call this the lesser trochanter. It attaches to this little piece on the femur. Now, the psoas is critical for posture, for movement, and really for your overall health. You see, what it does is, I'm going to set that down, is it also helps to create support, all right, to your organs in the abdominal area, to the blood vessels of the abdominal region, and also the nerves that are coming off that lumbar spine. So the psoas will help you, it helps move weight, from the back to the legs and the leg to the back, helps transfer force like that. But the other thing that it does is because of how it attaches to or arises off of the lumbar vertebrae there, it stabilizes your spine, okay? So think of this, think of your spine like a telephone pole, all right? Think of it like a big telephone pole. Now, what if that telephone pole was not buried in the ground, all right? So as you know, you go out there, we got electrical poles, telephone poles all over the place. And of course they bury those things deep in the ground. But imagine it wasn't buried in the ground, okay? That telephone pole would fall over. So what could you do? Let's say you couldn't bury it in the ground. What could you do? Well, you would attach guy wires. You would attach them from the ground up at different angles to the spine. And that's what the psoas does. You can see as it comes up, think of the spine like a big telephone pole, and that's coming up and attaching along the side and then attaching to the femur where it gives it the stability, all right? Now, if these guy wires, okay, if they don't hold or if they give way, what's going to happen? That telephone pole is going to fall over. What if the telephone pole, the guy wires on one side are a little loose, and on the other side they're like really super tight? What's going to happen? Well, I mean, you can imagine that telephone pole is going to lean one direction or lean the other. Everything would have to be perfectly balanced and all that tension would have to be equal. And that's exactly what has to happen with your psoas muscle, okay? Now, your psoas muscle, think of this, all right? It can contract and relax independently of its attachments at the joints, all right? So where it's attached, on your spine and down here, that muscle can still contract in the middle of it, and it can do that without moving these joints. So this helps it to counterbalance the imbalances in the structure of the spine, all right? So again, it's stabilizing that spine. If your spine is unbalanced, your psoas can help counteract that. But in order to do that, your psoas, it has to be healthy, okay? Now, imagine, all right, if the psoas, if it starts to shorten or it starts to lose its flexibility, now there are a lot of bad things that can happen, okay? So it will change how your body reacts to movement and stress. And then what happens is that causes other muscles to compensate for what it can't do. So if your psoas starts to become too tight or become shortened, it creates an uneven pull on the spine, like the telephone pole. That would be like your guy wires getting really tight on one side and getting a little loose on the other, okay? Or if you had guy wires and they were coming off at different angles, and one angle pulling more than the other. So what's going to happen is that's going to change, how that telephone pole sits. And that's the same thing that happens with your psoas. Is it comes, we're going to grab our other model, it comes off of here, And if that thing starts to tighten up, it will start to create a tipping of your pelvis in a forward direction. Okay, when that pelvis starts to tip, then the hip joints, they start to turn in a little bit. We call that internal rotation. Okay, they start to move to the inside. Now, that creates a secondary effect where your quad muscles, all right, they will start to compensate for the femurs changing in position. They'll start to overdevelop. Now, the other thing that will happen is, this is what you have to remember, is every muscle group in the body has an opposing muscle group. And those two groups have to be in balance with each other. Okay, so think of this like your biceps and triceps. That's a really good analogy for me to explain this. You know, your biceps are on the front of the arm, triceps are on the back, and when they're relaxed, it means they're in balance. They're relaxed. Nothing's happening. So it's a balanced system, meaning your arm can stay straight. Now, when you want to bend the elbow, the biceps, they have to contract and produce movement. However, if your triceps try to counteract that, no movement's going to occur. So your brain sends a signal to the triceps that says, shut down. It basically turns it off so your bicep can bend the elbow. Now, that's what we call reciprocal inhibition. I don't want to confuse you, but it's really a very important term to remember. Just remember that when movement's occurring, the muscle group that's producing the movement, the opposing group has to relax. The brain has to shut that off, okay? So, you know, what happens here is your pelvis starts to tip forward, femurs start turning in, quad muscles get overdeveloped. Well, when the psoas muscle starts to shorten, it will shorten because it's becoming overactive, all right? It becomes overactive and it becomes what we call hypertonic. Now, that means the muscle, remember we said that it can contract independently, right, of its joints. So the muscle, the psoas, starts to just knot itself up, okay, like a spasm. Or if you ever had a knot in your neck, you know how painful that is? You know, a knot is literally the muscle just all contracted up. That's happening in your psoas. So then the brain says, hey, the psoas is trying to work. We're going to shut the glutes off. So guess what happens if your brain sends a signal to your butt muscle and says, hey, you don't need to contract anymore. You can relax, okay? Your psoas is taking over. Well, the psoas can't do its work because now it's gotten shortened, it's hyperactive, and your gluteal muscle will actually weaken, okay? That reciprocal inhibition becomes chronic enough that those glutes will actually weaken. Now, this further will destabilize the back. And then it causes your back extensor muscles. You've got one muscle back here, we call it the quadratus lumborum, that runs off of the back side of the spine and then attaches to the top of the pelvis and up here to the ribs. That will start to knot up, okay? And so that's where people will get these really painful trigger points, and that creates a lot of compression back here in the spine, okay? So then they'll get back spasms. All of that is caused because the psoas isn't healthy, and it becomes overactive. So it creates this cascade of events in the body, and that all impacts the spine itself and manifests itself with this back pain. So now if somebody goes to see somebody for their back, and all they're doing is working on this area here, and they're just saying, oh, well, your back is weak, let's do some core strengthening, or you just need more flexibility. If you're not addressing that psoas directly, and there's things that you have to do in order to get it to shut off, your back pain's not going to get better. And so this is extremely complicated. The hips and the back, they're very involved, and it's all centered around that psoas. But the question then is, what causes the psoas to shorten? What causes it to lose its ability to function normally? Well, one of the main causes is exactly what I'm doing right now, okay? And it's plain and simple. It's sitting, all right? As we become more advanced in technology, we are sitting more and more. There's no doubt about it. We're driving more, in your morning commute. We sit down to eat, watch TV, spend all of our time on our computers, on our devices. When you go home, you relax on the couch. we're just doing a lot more sitting than we ever have in history of mankind. And in fact, it's very interesting because third world countries, okay, they don't have back pain like we do. And, one of the thoughts is because they're not as sedentary. A third world country, a lot of times you're more active because you have to go out and you have to get your own water in a lot of those cases. They have to, do more physical work. They're just up and moving. They don't just sit down to relax because that's not a part of their culture, being in a third world country. These developed countries, like Europe and the United States, and back pain is more prevalent, and that is because of the sitting, which then when you sit, it shortens that psoas. So if I put Bob in a seated position here, remember that muscle's coming right down here, okay? Now I'm going to shorten it because it's going to create some slack. And if you do that enough, eventually it'll stay shortened. And then when you try and straighten it out, it goes into that spasm. All right, so now you might say, well, I don't sit that much, Mike. Why am I getting it? I'm an athlete. I work out a lot. I run, I stretch, but I still get these problems with my back. You see, because not only is sitting a cause, and it is, but it's also the psoas can be impacted by repetitive movements and activities, all right? So, if you're doing the same thing, you're running the same way, you're biking the same way, you're doing the same movements. It could be at work. You could be climbing stairs and you always lead with one leg versus the other. You using that psoas too much in the same manner and not having things that are a little bit more, varied, in your activity levels. So even athletes, even those who are really active, can suffer a psoas imbalance. Now, the psoas is just not key to posture, hip power, and spine support. I want you to think about that. It's for posture, hip power, and spine support. It does all those things. But it is also directly linked to our nervous system, all right? So it has a very large impact on our central nervous system, which I'm going to go into that more next time because that's really important to understand. So, it'd be way too much for me to go into it today. I'd have too long of a video. So, we'll talk about that next time. But, that reminds me, if you haven't gotten a copy of my new ebook, The 5 Best Kept Secrets to Fast Back Pain Relief, you can get your copy just by emailing me at mike@flex-pt.com. Or you can shoot me a Facebook message on Messenger. Just request the back pain report, back pain ebook, and we'll get that sent right out to you. Like always, I like to leave you guys with a really good, thought-provoking quote. And one of my favorite authors is Francis Chan. And I'm going to leave you with this quote from him. And he said that giving that is not motivated by love is worth nothing. So I like to let you guys think about that one for a while. But until next time, power your life and keep moving forward.